Hello everyone, I am Wang, the cinematic lighter at Naughty Dog.
And I'm Abhishek Arora, graphics programmer at Naughty Dog.
At Naughty Dog, we put strong emphasis on quality of cutscenes. Here, you'll see the real-time cutscenes from our most recent released game, The Last of Us Part 2.
I'm gonna find. And I'm gonna kill. Every last one of them.
Making cutscenes real-time has challenges of its own. Today, I will go over the pipeline of cinematic lighting at Naughty Dog and introduce some features that helps us achieve good balance of quality and performance.
Getting these accurate in our cutscenes requires a lot of iteration between the artists and programmers, and could sometimes involve drastic changes to meet both our visual and performance goals. An example of a feature that required this high level of iteration in The Last of Us Part 2 was depth of field, and I will provide further insights into what work was done on this front in the second half of the talk. We will follow that up with a joint Q&A.
Let's get started. Lighting is one of the most important aspects of filmmaking and photography. However, the concept of lighting is fairly new in the gaming industry. Due to the nature of story-driven content in our games, Naughty Dog has focused on lighting as one of the main tools to convey mood, depth, and atmosphere. The artist will have a vision of what the correct lighting looks like, and it will require collaboration with programmers to deliver on that vision. Let me introduce what cinematic lighting at Naughty Dog is like. At Naughty Dog, the lighting department has two branches: level lighting and cinematic lighting. Level lighting provides lighting within game environments. The artist supports the narrative storytelling by setting the tone of the level. Cinematic lighting, which is the focus of my presentation today, concentrates more on characters. The artists are responsible to further refine the quality of lighting on the characters during cutscenes. This is a shot of Ellie from a cutscene on Last of Us Part 2. Most of the time, lighting on the background is provided by level lighters, and this is what characters looks like before we add any cinematic lighting and post-processing. And this is the final lighting of the cutscene. We mostly use Maya spotlights. Our basic workflow is that we'll get the scene file, and we edit lights in Maya. And we have a tool to connect Maya and DevKit in real time, so what we see here is what we will see in the final game. We will adjust position of the light, animate as needed, save keyframes, and go on to the next shot. Even though we use unique tools for lighting games, the basic principle of lighting is still same. I use classic 3-point lighting technique here. So here's my key, fill, and rim. Depends on cutscenes. We place bounce lights ourselves too, because we do not have global illumination or ray tracing. In fact, those are my favorite cutscenes because to me, finding bounce light is the most enjoyable part of lighting. I would like to briefly talk about concept art and reference gathering because it is such a big part of the cinematic lighting process in Naughty Dog, and it plays a significant role in terms of determining the initial look. After environment lighting and animation of the characters in good place, we start lighting cutscenes based on cutscene-specific concept art and environment keys. We also request shot-by-shot concept art as needed. It is also highly recommended to gather real-world references. We often look at screenshots of films or try to recreate the lighting scenarios ourselves. For example, if the cutscene happens in early morning, I will wake up early and take pictures. After all, Naughty Dog tech artists and programmers are striving to recreate physical phenomenon as shading and rendering technologies. We should also do the same. So that was the introduction of what cinematic lighting in Naughty Dog is like. Next, I would like to talk about some of the challenges of making cutscenes real time. All of the cutscenes in Last of Us Part 2 is happening real time, meaning it's not pre-recorded. The benefit of real-time cutscenes are that we can save disk space, faster iteration, and have smoother transition between gameplay and cutscenes. The disadvantages are that we have limited budget, and we cannot use any of the post-processing features such as Nuke or Fusion. Let's talk about budget and optimization first. Optimization is important even in films and commercials for faster and more stable renders, but it gets much more crucial in game. When GPU goes over budget and cutscenes, it will lower the frame rate and even skip frames. Last thing we want to do is take the experience away from players by having choppy cutscenes. Runtime light shadow is one of the more expensive features to render, and we are always battling with frame rate for better shadow quality when lighting real-time cutscenes. I mentioned earlier that we mostly use spotlights. This is because area light and point light shadows are too costly. We do use point lights occasionally for lamps and fire, but we keep the radius very small or have no shadow. And whenever we use spotlights, we also keep the radius and cone angle as tight as possible, so we do not waste the budget. Hair and skin is also very expensive. The cost of rendering is determined by number of lit pixels of skin and hair we see on the screen. So for close-up shots like these, optimization is necessary. I will introduce some of the features we have. We have optimization options per light for skin and hair. This is the skip hair feature. When this is turned on, the light will leave the hair unaffected. It is commonly used in fill light that is having hardly any effect on hair but contributing to the other parts of the characters. The other light attribute we have is hair only feature, which is opposite of skip hair. When this attribute is turned on, the light will only affect hair. This is used when we want to add extra rim on characters' hair. We also have the option to use scripting to optimize for hair and skin. Here, we can make the alpha hair switch to jitter render. Depending on the scene, we can easily save 1 to 2 milliseconds when this is turned on. And for skin, we can control the radius of subsurface scattering. Lower the number, cheaper it is. Now, let me show you how I balance between quality and budget in lighting cutscenes using these optimization methods. This is a shot of Ellie and her partner Dina from same cutscene I showed earlier. If I had unlimited budget, my dream light rig will be something like what you see in this diagram. We are looking at the shot from the top. The main key is coming from the window. I would then add light to wrap around from both front side and back side of Dina. From there, I would add 1 or maybe 2 fill light from the other side of the room. If I have more resources, I will add an extra rim light on Dina's hair. That was a total of 4 to 6 spotlights. If all of these lights cast full shadow and render everything, the shot will easily go over budget. And this is where all the optimization tricks comes in handy. Dina's fill has a skip hair feature turned on. Because her hair is dark and intensity of the fill is so low, it is giving little to no effect on both diffuse and spec value of her hair. Now, the same light that is giving this rim on Dina could have reached to Ellie and give nice rim on her cheek too. But I decided not to do that. Instead, I have one light with very small radius for Dina's rim. Then I added 2 very controlled, non-shadow casting lights to Ellie. These 3 lights are cheaper than one light that casts on everything. Because if I have one big light from the window, it is still calculating everything that we're not seeing from the camera, like the other side of each character's face. Let me explain what these 3 lights are doing. Dina's rim has full shadow, but the radius is very small and not reaching to Ellie at all. On Ellie, I have a light with skip hair feature turned on, and it is adding just enough light to enhance speck on Ellie's cheek and Dina's hand. The other light on Ellie has hair only feature turned on, so it will leave the skin unaffected. Again, the radius of the light is very small, and it adds subtle rim to Ellie's hair. Moving on to optimization with the scripting, for this shot, I made the hair dither render, because the difference between on and off is a bit more speck on Ellie's hair and subtle transition difference in Dina's hairline. I would rather save 1 millisecond than keeping that detail that we will barely notice when the shot is in motion. The optimization I did with lights and dithered render gave me enough budget for this shot to give full subsurface quality. So I chose not to lower subsurface scatter radius, even though that could also save me half a millisecond. I really wanted to keep the full effect of scattering on Dina's nose and lips. That was the introduction of optimization features and methodology. What I have shown is just an example. Each cutscene is unique, and sometimes it requires us to use different strategies. There are many more conditions that could make the cutscenes go over budget. It could be something in an environment such as glass and water, or it could be post-processing features like screen space shadow or motion blur. Knowing how much we can push the optimization without sacrificing quality is a very big part of lighting real-time cutscenes. Let's go to post-processing. I mentioned earlier, we cannot use post-processing software in real-time cutscenes. So effects like bloom, film grain, and vignette all need to happen in-game. While many of the post-processing features are set by level lighters and other departments like editorial and effects, we are responsible for the final tweaking during the cutscenes. Over the course of many projects, we collaborated with programmers and tech artists to build up post-processing features. One of the new effects that was added on Last of Us Part 2 is graduated filter. We can add an overlay of dark gradient on either top or bottom of the screen. It was often used to lead the viewer's eye to certain places, or convey cramped, intense atmosphere. The other feature that went through a big change during this project was the depth of field. Toward the end of the project, we started to see the artifact in cutscenes. We knew it was coming from depth of field, but it was not fixable with camera. So we collaborated with programmers and decided to make additional post-processing features. What I learned during the course of working at Naughty Dog is that communication is key. Artists will sometimes bring programmer over to debug visual artifact, and programmers won't see it because it's programmatically correct. However, it is important to programmers and artists to come together to find a solution that aligns with the artistic vision of the project. And now, I will hand it over to Abhishek to talk more about how we found solution to the depth of field problem.
Hi all, and thank you, Mari. I will be talking about depth of field in the cinematics of The Last of Us Part 2. Depth of field is a post-process effect that's ubiquitous in our game, predominantly so in the cinematics. As Mari stated earlier, since our cinematics are done in real time, all the post-processing we perform has to fit within the frame budget, and it is so with depth of field, which is just one of our many post-processing effects. More on the creative side, The Last of Us Part 2 is a very story-driven game, so our cinematic animators make heavy use of depth of field to focus the player's attention on specific parts of the cutscene, such as the character currently speaking, or something interesting in the distance. Before we dive into the details of depth of field, I will go over how this connects to the lighting and other art teams. The DOF issues were found by lighting artists since they own a set of cutscenes, and also by directors when they did their reviews. The first set of issues were listed and compiled, and I made a first set of fixes for them. Since it was late into development, these fixes were only applied where the issues were actually occurring to prevent any other breaks, just to be as safe as possible. As and when an artist found another issue after the initial fixes, we'd sit together, see if the existing fixes worked, and if not, I'd go back and debug what was going on. Here's a brief overview of this section of the talk. I will take you through some of the problems and constraints we faced at this late stage in the project, and walk through a few examples to show how they were analyzed and solved. But first, some brief background on depth of field and our implementation will be necessary as a prerequisite. Depth of field is a limitation of real cameras to be able to focus only on a single plane at a given point in time. Depending on various configurations like focal length, film width, and aperture size, the distance on either side of this focus plane that remains acceptably sharp or in focus is known as the depth of field. For a given focus plane distance, we will consider three layers: the far background, the in-focus region, and the close foreground. The circle of confusion is the most important term in depth of field calculations. Each point in an in-focus region, or within the depth of field, is visible as a point on that camera film. Points in the foreground or background that are out of focus, however, are expanded to circles, called circles of confusion, or COCs for short. There are two important properties of these circles. They can overlap with each other, thus blurring over one another if close and large enough. Also, if this overlapping happens, the energy of the point is preserved and spread over the circle, so the intensity of the circle is spread across its area. Thus, larger circles of confusion have less intensity or alpha at each point they overlap. Look at the COC intensity formula here, as we will be using this later. Here's a shot with very prominent circles of confusion overlapping, just for illustration. Moving on, some basic details about our DOF implementation will be necessary to discuss the problems and solutions ahead. Our implementation is based on Jorge Jimenez's work on Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, presented when he was a part of Activision. Here's how a shot looks before and after the depth of field effect is applied. Now, to go to our steps, the first step is to get a half-res color buffer. We do this for performance reasons. The blur step of DOF is very expensive. We then use a previously computed half-res min-depth buffer to compute some data buffers. The first one is a tiled buffer which contains the min and max COCs and min and max depths in each of the 80 times 45 tiles on the screen. We then compute a pre-sort buffer which contains a layer contribution fraction of each point for the foreground and background layers based on its depth and the minimum depth in the tile. If a given point's depth is much larger than the minimum depth in the tile, it is considered to be a background pixel. This pre-sort buffer also stores the COC value at each point for later computations, so that we can pull the relevant data from one buffer. The next step is the main step, the blur. Using the pre-sort and tile data as input, for each point, we gather samples in a circle of radius equal to the max tile COC, only allowing these samples if their own COCs are large enough to overlap the central point being computed. We also compute an alpha factor based on how strong the blur should be at each point for the upscaling step later. We then apply a 3x3 median filter on the blur color to reduce the ringing caused by not sampling each contiguous point in the circles of confusion, which would otherwise be very expensive. Finally, we superimpose the half-res blurred results on our full-res texture, weighted by a heuristic determined by the tile data, the full-res COC of the point, and, to slightly bias the result for foreground objects to diffuse strongly, the foreground alpha computed in the blur step. Now that we've covered the introductory details, let's dive into the meat of the discussion, how we solved the issues we faced with our depth of field. We had numerous issues in the cinematics that, after seeing the patterns, fell into these categories. I'll be doing a walkthrough of how we solved them using specific examples of cinematics and our debugging methodology. Since we were, at the time, 3 to 4 months away from gold when these issues were brought to the front, long after the cameras were set up for the cinematics, we couldn't afford to make vast sweeping changes like changing our DOF method entirely, so we had to make very targeted fixes. Here's the first example of a cutscene where the DOF had issues initially. In the video, we could see several issues in both the in-focus region and the background. To begin with, the character's hair receives incorrect blurring when it is supposed to be in focus. At the left edge of our face, we can also see some aliasing artifacts. Secondly, around the silhouette of the character, we see a small halo where the blur is inconsistent with the rest of the background. Lastly, in the video in motion, we could see that the background blur in general was unstable and would flicker a lot between frames. Now let's look into the DOF data and figure out what's going on here. First, we'll address the hair. Here's how the downsampled color buffer looks like before we use it to blur. We first look at the pre-sort buffer, which stores the COC and background and foreground factors. We immediately notice there's a little mismatch in the foreground color, the blue channel, around the edges and strands of hair. The background and foreground factors are entirely governed by depth, so the issue must be coming from the depth buffer. When these issues were identified, we were using a temporal depth buffer for post-processing to save time. Temporal anti-aliasing would be performed before these effects, and we also use a temporally accumulated depth buffer as a source depth for these effects. This explained why there were color depth discrepancies at the edges. The depth values were averaged out with the background pixels. This would not work for DOF at all, and certain prior works like that of Guillaume Abadi from Epic Games also state that we should always have 1:1 color and depth. We switched over to per frame depth and switched the ordering to perform temporal AA after DOF. This of course involved a bit of a compromise to also perform TAA on the half-res color buffer before it was used for blur. We also use a COC threshold to avoid performing TAA on the same pixels again in the full res pass. But as you can see, the buffer is darker and thicker where the hair is. So the hair depth values are lower than in the temporal depth buffer, as it should be. After making this change in the depth buffer used, this is the difference in the pre-sort buffer. This is how it looked first. And this is how it looks after the change. There's a lot more hair being classified as foreground. Again, for comparison, this is how the color buffer looked before. Notice both the hair and the aliasing on the left of the character's face. And this is how it looked after the change. This fix did of course involve a bit of compromise since we now had to do the additional temporal AA on the half-res color buffer used for blur. It added 0.1 to 0.2 milliseconds depending on the cutscene, so we used this fix only if we could afford it, or where the problem was really bad. But the additional upside to doing this is that the TAA also removes the edge aliasing artifacts. So the key lesson here for DOF is that color and depth absolutely need to be 1:1. We will revisit this idea in later fixes. Now we move on to the other two issues, the inconsistent blur halo around the foreground and the unstable background blur. We turn to our pre-sort buffer again. Noticing the window area in general, there's very little differentiation between foreground and background. Very little foreground, blue, around the bars of the window, and the area right around the character seems to have a very uniform background, green value. This is no doubt the source of the problem, the way we identify foreground and background. The initial implementation's foreground and background factor computation uses a fixed foreground distance to scale the difference between a given pixel's depth and the min depth in the tile. This is, in this case, a relative foreground scaling to bring out local differences in depth within the tile, not actually related to the foreground plane. Firstly, a global scaling constant for a local tile-specific classification will not yield accurate results at every depth. Also, the math used for the classification biases the value heavily toward the background, which is why we see a lot of background pixels around the window and very little foreground. To counteract this, we allow for more variation in these values by scaling based on the depth variation in the tile and allowing the foreground and background factors to be completely independent of each other. This produces a vastly different result for our pre-sort buffer, as shown above, adding much more pronounced foreground and background variation. So after the classification change, we went from this to this. We now have consistent blur around the foreground character and the window. Let's take a look at the video and see how stable this blur is in comparison. We move on to the next example. This time, before I show you the video, I want to point out the issue we're solving so you can see it in the video. hard cutoffs on the edges of the blurry foreground. This is visible more or less all over the foreground character who's holding the gun. Now let's see this in motion. Before we move on, let's talk very briefly about how each layer's color is computed. The scatter as you gather algorithm iterates over neighboring pixels in a heuristic radius. If a neighboring pixel overlaps with the current one based on its own COC value, it is added to both layers, weighted by both its pre-sort factor for the given layer and the COC's attenuation over its area, which we talked about earlier, the circle alpha. Now let's take a look at how both the layers are combined. Here's the background layer, and here's the foreground layer. Notice that it's thicker around the rifle. If we notice both layers though, they are very similar in the problem areas, and no way we combine them will yield the correct diffused foreground we want. Look around the character's face. So what's going on here? The answer lies in the COC values and how the circle alpha affects the weight of the color. The COCs of the blurry foreground, in red, are massive, while those of the in-focus character, in green, are very small. Thus, when we are accumulating the layer colors for one of the in-focus pixels, its own color will carry much more weight than the foreground color we want to diffuse over it. So a lot of the foreground color will be lost during the accumulation, dominated by the green pixel's weight, and therefore not seen diffusing over the focused area. To solve this problem, we introduce a middle layer, which holds the color of the main pixel of the shader invocation, and we don't add it to the other layers at all. So now we have three layers: background, middle, and foreground. Why this works well is none of the green points will intersect each other because their COCs are too small to overlap each other. So previously, the only sample polluting the layers was the central pixel itself. Now that the central pixel has its own layer, the background and foreground layers will only contain all the extra samples that need to be added as part of the DOF passes. These layers will now look very different. Here's the background layer. Here's the middle layer, which is just the unchanged color, and the foreground layer. Notice how this is much thicker than before and extrudes over the in-focus area way more. And the final result of compositing these three layers, no more hard cutoffs. Let's see this improved scene in the video. Just to cover our bases, this is how we are doing the compositing. It's just a simple compositing based on the alpha of the middle and foreground layers, applied sequentially. The foreground alpha calculation remains unchanged from Jimenez's version. And now, the final example. Again, let's first talk about the issue to be solved here. The pollution of the blurry foreground with the background color at the edges. Notice how parts of the blue background are appearing on the foreground. This is incorrect. To identify what's going on, we need to look into the samples we're gathering during the blur step. For a high COC like the foreground currently has, we gather 3 rings of samples. The first ring has 8 samples, the second ring has 16, and the third has 24. Now, if we go just back to ring 1, we can already see the error here, the thin lines of blue samples in between samples of the foreground character. This is a good illustration of how DOF can take a very tiny error and make it look much bigger owing to accumulation of the error. We need to have a look at individual samples within this ring to try to isolate one instance of the issue. This is the first sample in the first ring. The next sample going in an arc. And combining these two, we get this, the first instance of the error. Somehow, the DOF blur is accumulating the background color as part of the foreground. Thus, the pre-sort buffer is the usual suspect. Let's look at the last two samples and their pre-sort values. Here's the first sample again, and its pre-sort value. It may be difficult to see here, and it took me a few seconds of staring at a very big screen to find this. But the outline of the foreground character's face in the pre-sort buffer is a pixel or two off of that of the color buffer. Let's magnify this just to see it easier. I've shifted the hue a little and marked the edge of the character's nose in the pre-sort buffer in black to make this easier to see. Let's keep our eyes there as I move to the color buffer. As we can see here, there's a bit of the background color erroneously classified as foreground. This error is accumulated to a great extent to give us the artifact we saw. The conclusion from this is that our color and depth are not 1:1. But we have already ordered DOF and TAA here correctly from the earlier fix, and have also obeyed all our previous work's recommendations to use a point sampler and not a linear sampler during the blur step, like Souza from Crytek recommended. What else could have gone wrong? The error traces back to the downsample step. It's not just the blur pass where we have to be wary of the linear sampler. Even in this step, the downsample step, which we do for performance reasons, error can be introduced by blending pixels or by selecting the wrong pixel in each 2x2 full res set. Recall that the depth buffer we use to generate the pre-sort data is also a half-res depth buffer. This is a min-depth buffer, meaning we select the minimum of the 4 pixels in each 2x2 full res set to get the corresponding pixel in the half-res buffer. So in order to maintain the 1:1 depth to color, we need to choose the same pixel in the 2x2 set that was chosen when creating the half-res min-depth buffer. Let's see how things look after the fix. Here's before, and here's after. Now, much more of the character's face and hair is visible with the correct amount of blur, since we're not adding unwanted background color. This even improves the in-focus character's hair. Now let's see this in motion. So that was a summary of the issues we faced. The issues fixed here were also present in other cinematics, so they also ended up looking much better. And here's an illustration based on the issues that Mari showed us. Here's issues with the TAA ordering and with the background inconsistency to do with the classification. Here the edges of the foreground character's face are messed up owing to the TAA ordering, and also the background character has some weird artifacts around her head, particularly the top right corner. And here there's like some severe background issues going on because of that unstable background foreground classification. Well, that's it. Thank you, and I hope this practical walkthrough of fixing depth of field issues was helpful. An extra shout out to all those in the industry who have shared their valuable insights on depth of field in the past. In conclusion, our real-time cinematics involved a lot of iteration between all departments involved, needed to balance visuals and frame rate, and required great care to not introduce any new bugs or cause frame rate issues towards the end, especially when taking care of major issues like depth of field.
That concludes our presentation. I would like to thank the Naughty Dog programmers and tech artists for their support. And I would especially like to thank the cinematic lighters and concept artists for not just their support, but also their contribution with images and videos. Last but not least, I would also like to thank Vincent and Ricard for giving us the opportunity to participate in SIGGRAPH Asia. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoyed the talk.